Hi folks, I'm smoking my skull pipe with these little red eyes, and in it I've got some Night Watch, which is nice tobacco to smoke in the run up to Christmas, I suppose, the Night Watch. Excuse me while I light it. This is a VR to Yardism on failure and success, and he asks us to quote a failure that became a success. And it's quite difficult because I've had a lot of what I think of as failures in my life. One of them was to be put in charge of a church in Crewe. It was an old railway church, built by the railways, so it was more like a barn than a church. It had industrial heating in, so you had to turn it off if ever you wanted to say anything. Otherwise it roared like a steam train coming down the tracks. It was a church with quite a few people in it. It wasn't a dead church as such, but they'd had financial difficulties in that somebody had cleaned them out of money, and they'd managed to get most of that money back, but they wanted a priest who would bring the church into fruition and growth. For some sad reason, the bishop chose me. It was a difficult church to be in charge of in a way. They were quite happy with me. Things were going as well as could be expected. And I was there for, I don't know how many years, but it wasn't a long time that I was there, and you'll understand why in a moment. It was a church that the people were content with what they'd got. One of them said to me, "As long as the church is here to bury me, that's all I'm bothered about." And that kind of attitude. And when I preached, it felt that I was preaching into a void. There seemed to be absolutely no comeback, no response, no feeling in the congregation. And then we got some dry rot, and we managed to afford to repair that. I asked one of the nuns at the community in Chester, a friend of ours, if she would come and preach, just to see what she thought might be the problem. And afterwards she said, "Your congregation's just so self-centred and settled in itself, they couldn't care about anything else. They're not really bothered about the church growing." And I had some people who wanted to come to my church, some Hell's Angels who'd become Christians. And in the end, I decided that it would be the worst thing that could happen for them. So I took them to a Baptist church and introduced them to the minister there, and they got on very well there. But it was how to break through to the congregation. They really weren't going to change. And then we suddenly found that we couldn't afford to keep going, or they felt they couldn't afford to keep going. And we had to have a special meeting to decide what we were going to do. And I called the meeting for the parochial church council, which made the decisions for the church. I told them that we would put all the facts before them, and then we would take a vote as to what we were going to do. If the vote was tied, I would cast the deciding vote to stay with the status quo. During the meeting, it came out that we hadn't got all the money back that had been taken, that we were in real financial difficulties. They wanted to know what I was going to do about it. And I was brutally honest with them and said that I didn't think we were spiritually viable as a church, that there was no results to whoever preached there, that there was no growth or change in the congregation, and that if I'd felt that we were spiritual viable, I would fought to keep the church open. But I felt it should be closed, and we put the facts forward, and people discussed it. They argued about it. They were very angry with me, and in the end, it came to the vote. And the vote was unanimous that we should close, that I should put into action and talk to the bishop about it, about the church closing. Everybody said that if it closed, they would never go to church again, and they would never go to another church. The bishop's decision was that a church next door had just, its vicar had just left, and he felt that we should unite, that we should join together in one church in their building, and that I should be the vicar. When the congregation found out that the plan was to everybody should go to the new church, they all said no, that they weren't interested, that it was a totally different church and they wouldn't do it. They would rather go their own separate ways to different churches. But over the weeks in preparation, I'd prayed about it and I'd preached about it, about the change, about unity, about strength, and about the possibility of uniting the two churches. The bishop said, would I be the vicar there? And I said, no. And he asked why, and I said, well, it wouldn't be right to put me in to the other church as a fait accompli. That I felt that the best thing was to have a totally new vicar at that church, and that I should be moved on to somewhere else. And that's what was decided, that I would be moved, the church would close, and whatever would happen would happen. On the surface, it seemed like a total failure to me. I'm there with a congregation who are refusing to go to the new church, who are angry at the person involved in the financial irregularities. When the time came for the move, we lost one member of my congregation. All the rest decided to move and join that church. And there were enough people at the new church to help my people to be spiritually viable. And that church prospered and was a success. Now, it seems to me that although it appeared a failure and was a failure, that a church building had to close and the congregation had to move, it was a success that I'd failed, but I'd successfully inspired the people enough to move, although at the time I didn't think anybody would. So that's one example where I think success did come out of failure. But I'm convinced that in every failure are the roots of success, if we but look for them, if we but act on the situation. I know that sounds an odd thing to say, but if you think of Edison, I don't know how many attempts he had at producing a light bulb. And I think it was 200 or something like that, but I may be wrong. But he was once asked, you failed 200 times to make a light bulb before you made a light bulb. And he said, no, I didn't. He said, I found out 200 ways not to make a light bulb. And I thought that was very wise words. You know, it wasn't a failure. I didn't fail at all. I just found that that wasn't the way to make a light bulb. You know, and so often we'd look upon each attempt as a failure. But he didn't. He looked on each failure as a success in one way. You know, oh, well, that's not the way to do it, so we'll try something else. When I look back on my life, there are things in my life that have been very, very difficult. My psychiatrist, when he took me apart and put me back together again, said, Stephen, you survived. And he said, that's a miracle in itself. Most people wouldn't have survived what you've been through. In fact, he told me he thought I was the only one who would survive. It took a lot of coming to terms with. But I look back on the times I felt failure, the times I felt success, the times when bad things happen. And from looking back from here, I realise that the majority of things that happen to us, in the great scheme of things, in our lives, are not as great as we think they are. You know, even the death of Michaela, our daughter, hard as it was, taught us many lessons. It taught us to hold the children that we were to have later with a light rein, to realise that we were there to help them live, not to making sure that they were a success. And I believe that that's why I can say my children are my friends. I don't think we'd have learnt that lesson without the loss and pain we felt. There are other things that I look back on that in the great scheme of things seemed so important, so vital. And yet looking back, I think, why on earth was I worried? Why did I get so worked up about it? Life goes on. People go on. And they come through, usually. One of the failures I felt I had in one of my first churches was a man had lost his wife and he was naturally very, very distraught. and I would go and visit him and try and help him to come through his grief. But his grief was almost an unnatural grief. And he said to me, if you don't come and visit me each week, I will commit suicide. And of course, I didn't go every week, and he committed suicide. And I thought that was my fault. I'd failed. I'd failed to give him what he needed. I'd failed to keep my word and go and visit him. And a very wise priest took me to one side and said, you know, Stephen, we have to allow people to commit suicide. We have to let them do it if necessary. Because if they're going to do it, they're going to do it. If we stop them, they'll find a way if they're really confirmed in their idea of destruction. And it's something I've realised, that we're not responsible for what other people do. We can affect it. We can sometimes make a mess of it. But it's up to them how they react. It's not because of us that they react in a certain way. It's their decision. Failure and success are just different sides of the same coin. They're like life and death, failure and success, love and hate. In some ways, we can choose what we do. We can choose love, or we can choose hate. It's very easy for me to say that, you're thinking, you know, and it's not true. But think about it. You know, how quickly some people's love withers and turns to hate. And how sometimes hate turns to love. It's not the other person that decides love and hate. It's us. Even in marriages that fail, we can choose how we approach that and how we cope with it. I know we all cope with it in different ways, and I know that some people are destroyed by it. I'm not saying that they're wrong or that it's their fault, but I'm saying we do sometimes have a choice of how we cope, of what we decide, of what we come to realise. The older you get, the more you realise that life's just very short on this earth. The nearer you come to death, the more you realise the joy of life and living. I don't fear death. I fear the process of dying, maybe. But death's just a part of life. It's the price we pay for having lived. So we might as well live trying to be happy, trying to love, and trying to account even our failures as success. Now, I'm aware that that probably sounds a whole load of rubbish, and it might be. But it's the way I feel, having lived on this earth for 60 odd years, 68 years or so. Next year could be the last. Tomorrow could be the last. And I've never heard anybody say when they're on their deathbed, I wish I'd have spent more time at the office. I wish I'd have spent more time working. It's usually, I wish I'd have spent more time with the family. I wish I'd have spent more time enjoying life. I wish I'd have spent more time not worrying about the failures, but seeing them what they really are. Experiences to be learnt from. I'm going to finish there, and if I've hurt anybody by what I've said, I'm sorry. Somebody said that I'd stolen May Your God Go With You. There was a comedian on television, and Carolyn will have to quickly tell me his name.
Oh, David somebody.
And he was an Irishman, and it was at the time of all the religious troubles, and he would never say whether he was a Roman Catholic or not. It's a man called Dave Allen.
Dave Allen,
and he used to say at the end of every programme, may your God go with you. And that's what I do now, tend to say, may your God go with you. May you be blessed.